I know we're all used to being a little bit angry in Philadelphia about our sports teams, but at this point it's starting to get a little bit ridiculous considering the Eagles are 2-0 and the Phillies are on the brink of making the playoffs again. If you're going to save your anger, just do what Shane does and save it for the Flyers. We'll get into all three of those teams on this episode of Sports Talk Philadelphia. Welcome back to Sports Talk Philadelphia. As always, I'm your host, Aidan. I'm joined by my usual co-host and co-producer, Shane Nolan. Shane, how are you?
I'm doing good.
And for the first time ever, we have on Riley Kapchek. Riley, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. Happy to have you here. We're going to start by getting right into the Philadelphia Eagles, who had a great win last Thursday against the Minnesota Vikings. They won 34-28. Jalen Hurts had a pretty good performance, only passed for 23 attempts, but completed 18 passes for 193 yards. But he did have 3 total touchdowns as well as an interception. DeAndre Swift was the big star of this game, 28 carries, 175 yards and a touchdown. And Devontae Smith, just another great performance, 4 receptions, 131 yards and 1 TD. Riley, I'm going to go to you first. What was your big takeaway from this game?
My big takeaway was there's no doubt that Jalen Hurts is a great player. He was MVP last year, but I feel like there's some sort of, it could be mental or physical, like dust that he still needs to wipe off from last season, considering there was a lot of forced throws. But regardless, DeAndre Swift had a great game with only his second game as a Philadelphia Eagle. Going 175 yards and scoring on top of that is pretty good, and he has a very bright season ahead of him.
Yeah, so Swift didn't have barely any touches at all in the first game. One carry, was targeted like one time, and that was basically it. Gets this many carries, broke LaShawn McCoy's record for most rushing yards in a performance back when LaShawn McCoy did it in the Snow Bowl famously. No one had ever had that many attempts or rushes since then. So, Riley, it is good to see the running game sort of finding its feet. And do you think that that is something that they're going to lean on more as the season continues?
Oh, most definitely. If they see that now, it's only the second game again. There's going to be multiple games where he's going to showcase even more talent than he already has done. So, again, he's going to have a great season, and Philly's going to warm up to him real quick.
Yeah, and it was great to see all this. There was one little point of controversy when A.J. Brown seemed very frustrated that he was only targeted 4 times, had 4 receptions for 29 yards. He was sort of talking to Jalen Hurts and a couple of the coaches as well. It doesn't seem like it's a really big deal, but in the future, could this be a problem with A.J. Brown if he doesn't feel like that he's getting targeted enough in games?
I think so. A.J. Brown nearly threw a tantrum on the sideline after the pass didn't go his way. If that's still like a mental thing in the game, then that could really reflect on how other players see that and react.
Yeah, so not only did the offense play well, but the defense also at certain points played very, very well. First 4 Vikings fumbles, recovered all 4. Terrell Edmonds had a great play on Justin Jefferson where he forced a fumble out of the end zone, which ended up being the game-winning saving touchdown. And on one bad note, Avonte Maddox, who is another Eagles defensive back starter, is going to be out the rest of the season, possibly with a pectoral injury in his shoulder. Riley, I'm going to start with the positive stuff first. It was really good to see the Eagles forcing turnovers in this way rather than just getting interceptions.
Yes. Eagles defense overall really stood out this past game with the Vikings because there was times where the Vikings, they were playing, but they weren't going far. They weren't going anywhere. They were redoing it. And then to the point where the ball did get intercepted or just ended the play.
Yeah, and another really big sticking point with this Eagles defense is how good the defensive line's been early on. They already have the best rush defense in the NFL. We're seeing so many young guys. Jalen Carter's really played very well. You're seeing older guys like Fletcher Cox step up. So it's good to see that even though there's a lot of injuries with the defensive backs, that defensive line is going to be a really big sticking point for them this year.
I agree.
So when it comes to those injuries, though, in the defensive backfield, you're already out a couple different starters. Maddox is one that's going to be out for a while. You've got Sidney Brown stepping up for a lot of these safeties that are hurt. So, Riley, who do you see stepping up in a big moment for the defensive backs with all these injuries?
For that, I'm not quite
Yeah, I mean, it is
Sure.
sort of like a big problem that they have.
Yeah,
for
it's
sure.
something they'll have to like regroup as a team to go forward to make the correct choice.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a lot of different options that they could trade for possibly. Their depth is something that Howie Roseman's been really big on in the offseason, so it's good to see that some of these younger guys like Brown and a couple other people have really stepped up. We're going to go to the standings next because this is sort of interesting to see. Yes, the Eagles are 2-0. The Cowboys are also 2-0. Somehow the Commanders are also 2-0, even though that they've been a little bit shaky, and there was a comeback where they almost lost to the Broncos. And the Giants also had a huge comeback against a familiar face in Jonathan Gannon and are 1-1. So, Riley, I'm going to go to the Cowboys in a little bit, but how surprised are you that the Commanders are 2-0?
The Commanders, after last season, I feel like it's definitely something you didn't expect, especially with the Saints as well. They left the season with a 7-10 their last season. So for them to also be 2-0 as well as the Commanders being good, it's definitely not expected, but we'll see how it plays.
Yeah, and the Cowboys have looked like one of the best teams in the NFL. They have probably the best defense player, if not one of the best players in the NFL, and Micah Parsons. Dak Prescott has done a much better job not turning over the ball. Tony Pollard's been a great number one back. CeeDee Lamb looks like a number one receiver. There's not a whole lot of weaknesses in this Cowboys team. How worried are you that they might win the division over the Eagles?
Very worried. And no Eagles fan wants the Cowboys to win over the Eagles. So I feel like if the Eagles compose better plays, better defensive line, better overall team development, by the time they play the Cowboys it comes to the point where they might go ahead of them, there has to be something that stops it. Cowboys.
Yeah, and you talked about some of these teams that are 2-0, the Saints, the Commanders. Another one that is 2-0 that's a bit of a surprise is the Buccaneers, who the Eagles will be facing next week. It's a little bit surprising to see, mostly because of how well Baker Mayfield has played, which is a little bit shocking from where they were last year. Mayfield, for the first time in his career, is 2-0. So far this season, 490 yards, 3 touchdowns, only no interceptions, in the first 2 games. And the Bucs defense has been really solid. 7 sacks, 3 interceptions in the first 2 games. So, Riley, what do you think the Eagles have to do to put pressure on Baker Mayfield to make him become that mistake-prone quarterback that we've seen from him in the past?
So I put both of them how they both played the Vikings. When the Buccaneers played the Vikings, they ended up 20-17, which is a very close game. But when we played the Vikings, it was 34-28. So I feel like if we keep what we did in the past Vikings game and they apply that to the upcoming game versus the Buccaneers, then there'll be a more positive outcome to that, and I do feel like we could beat the Buccaneers.
So when you see the Buccaneers pass rush, 7 sacks is a really big number. The Eagles' offensive line got off to a bit slower start. Do you expect the Eagles to be able to slow down that pass rush as the game happens?
It'll eventually be slowed down, hopefully.
Yeah. Do you guys, Shane, Riley, any score predictions for this game?
I'm going to go with 35-28.
Pretty high scoring game. All right, Riley, what about you?
I'm going to go, I feel like it's going to be close, about like a 20-28.
All right, so you guys are predicting high. I'm going to go with a lower score. I think that these are 2 really solid defenses at this point. I expect both offenses at certain points to come up with big plays. I'm going to go 17-14 Eagles. I think that they do show the Buccaneers that Buccaneers are going to come back a little bit more to reality, but, man, they're both pretty good teams at this point. So I guess we'll just see what happens when the game's played on Monday night. We're now going to go into the Phillies, who are also very successful at this point in the season. They're now at an 83-69 record, which is much more improved than it was last year at this point in the season. And there's still some games to go. They've won 2 very big series over the Cardinals and the Atlanta Braves, although the Braves did win the division, so that means the Phillies are just fighting for a wild card spot. And the next series for the Phillies is against the Mets, which is not as sort of highlighted as it was going to be earlier this year when everyone thought the Mets would be good. But at this point, it's still a pretty big series for the Phillies. Shane, what is your expectations for what happened against the Braves and how they could play against the Mets?
Well, the Phillies always seem to play the Braves well, no matter how good or bad either team is. And it's always a very close game against the Braves, at least with the occasional blowout by either team, like it was these first 2 games of this series. But the Mets have been playing a lot better than what they were in the second half of this season. So it is going to be a tough series against the Mets, but you're at home. You have 4 games against them. You have to finish the Mets off.
Yeah, and all those highlights that you're seeing right now came from the first Braves game where they won 7-1. They hit 5 home runs, which is just a crazy record to have against the Braves. In the last game series, Castellanos had 2 home runs. Riley, how important is it for the Phillies to continue this home run success that they've had since the beginning of August through the rest of the season?
It's very important to keep it up. They want to remain in the top wild card spot. They have 11 games to go. Hopefully the pitching gets back on the right track, but overall it'll be a very interesting final 2 weeks of Phillies baseball.
Yeah, you definitely talked about the pitching. That's something that Rob Thompson has talked about, something a lot of Philly fans have talked about. Rob Thompson did come out and say what his postseason rotation would be, so we have them up right now along with the stats. So the first guy that he's going to have is Zach Wheeler, not Aaron Nola, which does make sense when you see how Wheeler's pitched this year. 12-6 with a 3.70 ERA. Nola is 12-9 with a 4.57 ERA. His ERA ballooned a little bit more since July, but it's come back down a bit. Taijuan Walker, 15-5 with a 4.40 ERA. And Ranger Suarez will close out the rotation with only a 3-6 record, but he has been hurt with a 3.80 ERA. So, Shane, I'm going to go with you first. What is your expectations of the rotation for the rest of the season as well into the postseason?
Well, obviously I expect them to pitch very well, especially Nola and Walker. Nola against the Braves for the last game of the series, he did pitch well. He kept the ball down. He didn't throw too many balls out over the middle of the plate, which has been his problem for the whole year. He leads the league in giving up home runs. So he did pitch very well. He went 6 innings. Same thing with Taijuan Walker. He's been losing his velocity a lot and everything. So I expect them to pitch well down for the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, one guy that I mentioned, Ranger Suarez, hurt a lot of the year. He's come back. He's looked okay at certain points, but it still looks like he has a lot of rust. Riley, are you expecting him to be that main 4th guy, or do you think the Phillies might have to go with someone else in the postseason?
Considering Ranger Suarez came back he had a hamstring injury. He was out basically all summer. Zach Wheeler started for him a lot. But since he didn't play a lot this summer, his injury isn't like that much of a common thing. It's not like a shake it off and then it'll be better. So if his improves, I feel like he could still be like in that lineup somehow.
Yeah, and for the Phillies, they do have a lot of depth in the rotation, maybe not as much as people think. Christopher Sanchez has been really good. Matt Strahm was used a lot early in the season, was a key guy before getting moved to the bullpen. Shane, if Ranger struggles, doesn't look healthy, if Nola really struggles, could you see Rob Thompson going to one of those guys?
Probably Christopher Sanchez, because he did say that he did the other day in Sanchez's start against the Braves. He's going to use Michael Lorenzen as a piggyback out of the bullpen. It didn't go so well the first time, but Christopher Sanchez has pitched very well. So let him go at least 6 or 7 innings if he's pitching well, because you leave Nola and Walker in a little too late. So I think it's going to stay the way it is, but yeah, you can use Christopher Sanchez a little bit more.
Yeah, and the Phillies have announced they're going to go with a 4-man rotation, which isn't that strange for the postseason anymore. But the Phillies really could have used a 5th pitcher this year, whether it was Andrew Painter, who got hurt in spring training, ended up not making any starts for them this year. They could have traded for a 5th pitcher. They ended up deciding not to do that. Does the lack of a 5th pitcher, Shane, really hurt them in the postseason because these guys have logged so many more innings than a lot of other rotations this year?
I think it can. I mean, we kind of seen it last year when they got into the World Series, because a lot of these pitchers haven't gone that far in their careers to where some of them went last year. So I think it does. But I feel like some of these guys, I feel like Wheeler, Suarez, they're a little bit more comfortable and stuff. And I mean, Ranger Suarez always looks very confident when he's out there pitching and stuff like that. So I feel like this year won't be a problem.
Yeah, so when it comes to what's going to win the World Series, Riley, do you think it's going to be hitting or the pitching?
Definitely the pitching. As you can say, if the pitching's not good, the game's not good. So if we have a good pitching streak, I feel like that could really lead us to where we need to be.
Yeah, and the Phillies are at a really good spot right now, as Shane mentioned. First in the wild card standings, 3 games up on the Diamondbacks, 3.5 up on the Cubs. And the Marlins and Reds are fighting it out with the Cubs for that last spot. It's a very interesting setup for them. Right now the Phillies are playing the Diamondbacks at home. Shane, how confident would you be going into a series between those two teams?
So I'd rather play the Cubs. I feel like they can hit the Cubs pitching a little bit better. I mean, they did sweep them in June, and I know regular season is the same as the postseason, but still, I think the Diamondbacks pitching staff is a little bit better, and we're kind of seeing that coming down the stretch a little bit. So I feel like the Cubs are going to be the best fit for the Phillies if the Phillies want to win the wild card series.
It is an interesting point to mention that the Phillies didn't host an entire playoff series at home, at least having the advantage in it. Last year, they're in St. Louis for 2 games in wild card, where the away team against both Atlanta and the Padres in the NLCS and LDS, and then they were also the road team, the Astros, when it came down to a clinching Game 6. Riley, how important do you think it is for the Phillies mentally to have a home playoff series this year?
I think it's going to be very important. Obviously, a bunch of Philly sports, the Phillies fans show out. So if they have that support, they have that mentality, they can go together and win it.
Yeah, that's something that they talked about a lot last year as a team, just how much passion fans had that they didn't really realize it because the team hadn't been great for a while. Shane, if they can get past the Diamondbacks, they're going to have to run into the Dodgers, and then if they can somehow get past that, the Braves. Do you think this team can make a run the way that it did last year?
I think they can. I don't think if they have to play the Dodgers, I don't think that's going to be a big problem. The Dodgers pitching staff, they're young. They're missing Walker Buehler. They do have Clayton Kershaw, but there are a lot of young, inexperienced starting pitchers for the Dodgers, and I don't think the Phillies bats will have a problem against them. But like I said, they also match up well against the Braves all the time. So I feel like if they play the Braves in the division series again, I feel like they can take them in 4 games again like they did last year.
Yeah, and a quick yes or no question: should Dylan Covey be on the postseason roster?
No.
Thank you. Yeah, that's been a pet peeve of mine, seeing him pitch. So at least someone here agrees with me. We're going to go into the Flyers next, sort of the way we talked about the Sixers last week with their offseason. Flyers had an interesting one, not as much talked about for them. They did finish 31, 38, and 13th, which was 7th in the Metropolitan at the end of last year. Carter Hart, 22, 33, 10, a little less than 3 goals per game. And John Tortorella is back for his second season as head coach after a much improved Flyers team under his first year. So Shane, what are you expecting from Tortorella in his second year?
I'm expecting the Flyers to play a little bit better than they did last year. I mean, Tortorella is a hard-nosed coach, so he's going to have these guys play a tough game. So I do expect them to be a little bit better than they were last year.
Yeah, and from a Flyers perspective, how important is it to see that improvement in Tortorella's first year, to have the confidence of him to keep him as their head coach?
It's important because a lot of the young guys, you need these guys to show that they belong here on this team and show that there is going to be a bright future for this team with guys like Farabee, Konechny, Tyson Forrester if he makes a team out of training camp, Morgan Frost, who they just recently signed. So I feel like it hinges on a lot of the young players this year.
Yeah, and Carter Hart, there was some rumors then, which we'll get into, but he played much better last year than he had in a couple previous years. Sort of looked like the Carter Hart of old. How important is that for the Flyers' development if they decide to keep him around?
It's very important because they've obviously had goalie problems for almost like 50 years or so. But if they get better defense, you just seen his numbers again in front of one of the worst defense in the league. So if he gets a little bit better defense in front of him, his numbers are going to look a lot better. And he's a great young goalie. He hasn't reached his prime yet. He's going to reach prime in another year or so. But we're going to be in a rebuild for it, so we have to see what happens.
Yeah, and part of that rebuild does not include Connor Bedard, who the Flyers decided not to tank for. Instead, they got Matvei Michkov with the 7th overall pick, which was considered a huge steal. Biggest issue is that he's still currently playing in the KHL in Russia, so we won't get him for a couple years at least. They also re-signed Noah Cates and Cam York to a couple 2-year deals. And Danny Briere, very interestingly, on a radio show hosted by Glenn Macnow and Mike Sealski, mentioned that all options are on the table for Carter Hart, which is a bit of an interesting comment. So, Shane, I'll start with the more positive news. How important was it to get Michkov in the draft?
It was very Very important. This guy is a superstar. You haven't had some guy like this, drafted some guy like this, since probably Eric Lindros. If it wasn't for Connor Bedard and with all the things going on in Russia right now, he probably would have been the #1 overall pick, but so many teams passed up on him because of what's happening right now. As well with, he won the MVP in the Hockey World Championships under 18 team, beating out, I know Connor Bedard won the gold medal, but he scored, where do I have it? He scored 12 goals and 4 assists and 16 points, beating out everybody else, including Connor Bedard. So I'm just saying, Aidan.
Yeah, okay, all right. Look, I'm just happy the Blackhawks have someone that's considered one of the best players of all time. Well, that could potentially be, at least I'll say. But you mentioned the political stuff happening in Russia. That was a big reason why Mishkov fell. How nervous are you that the fact that he might not play in the NHL, which a lot of other teams were concerned about when drafting Russian players?
I think he will play in the NHL. I mean, a lot of guys have played in the KHL already. Alex Ovechkin, Evgeny Malkin, and they have no problem coming over here. I don't think that's going to be a problem because, I mean, right now he's not technically playing in the KHL and for their top team that he was playing for because he wasn't getting a lot of minutes because all they do over there is play a lot of the veteran players. So he's playing with Team Sochi right now. He's getting a lot of minutes to play, but they play there for 3 years. They have to live up to that. They have to play out that contract before they come over. But I don't think it'll be a problem.
And before we wrap up the segment, those comments by Danny Briere were very interesting considering it was just on like a radio show. He wasn't really prompted into asking it. Are you where are you on trading Carter Hart or keeping him with the team?
I feel like it should be a decision based on how Hart feels because, by the time they're good again, he's going to be at least 28, 30 years old. And if he wants to go on and win a cup somewhere else, I feel like let him do that because he's going to be halfway through his career, and I know he's not going to want to stay with a rebuilding team for the rest of his career.
Do you see him potentially as someone that could win a Stanley Cup, whether it's with the Flyers or some other team?
Yeah, I do. I mean, could be one of the best goalies in the league. Every goalie has to have a good defense in front of him. So.
Yeah, the Flyers' defense is definitely something that's lacked the last few years. We'll see if they can get it together this year. We're now going to go into the Fast Five and starting off with our favorite segment, Talking Baseball with Shane Nolan.
Well, finally, the Tampa Bay Rays are going to be getting a new stadium in 2028 and getting out of Tropicana Field, which is one of the worst stadiums in the league. If it wasn't for Oakland Stadium, it probably would be the worst with all the catwalks they have and balls getting stuck in the catwalks and everything. So it's good for Tampa Bay fans to finally be getting a new stadium, which looks really nice.
It does look really nice. Interesting that it's not in Tampa, but in St. Petersburg. But either way, it's good to see the Rays getting a new stadium. Riley, I'm going to go next to you. There's been a lot of injuries to key guys in the NFL, but has there been someone that stuck out as a possible MVP candidate early in the season?
I haven't gone too deep into other teams yet, but a possible MVP, if we're talking Eagles, of course, I'd pass it down to this week's Player of the Week, DeAndre Swift, especially after last Thursday's performance.
Yeah, you could definitely see him getting really big numbers. Another guy could be Devontae Smith. Mostly it's a quarterback award still, but I could see a running back winning it if the Eagles stick with the carries that they have. So that's a good choice. Shane, going to go back to, going to stick with Riley. Who's your most surprising NFL team after week 2?
I've already said this already, but I'm going to come back to it. The most surprising 2-0 NFL team so far would be the Saints because they did come out from a 7-10 season last year. So for them to be undefeated right now, it's good. And their defense has definitely upgraded. They have a bunch of new young players, and they're strong. They're strong right now.
Yeah, getting Derek Carr, too, in the offseason definitely does not hurt your chances at being a postseason team, as well as playing in one of the weaker divisions. Although, again, having the Bucs at 2-0 is just crazy to me. I would not have guessed that would have happened. Shane, going to go back to you for another baseball question. The wild cards, at least the last ones, are pretty wide open in both divisions. Who do you have winning both the AL and NL third place wild card?
I think the Cubs are going to stay in the third. I think the Cubs are going to stay in the third place wild card spot. They have a little bit of an easier schedule to finish off the season. And for the AL, I think it's going to be Seattle. I think Texas's bullpen has been not the best lately. and I think they're going to continue to fall off, and I think Seattle is going to take that last wild card spot.
Yeah, how shocked are you that the Rangers just completely fell off from being top in the AL West to now potentially missing the playoffs altogether?
They have been in first place in that division since April 8th, I think it was, and lost it in the second week of September. So it's very surprising. They went on a seven or 8 game winning streak after the All-Star break as well. So there's that, but because of their bullpen hasn't been good after that. I feel like they're just going to fall.
Yeah, and also losing Max Scherzer as well does not help. Besides the Phillies, could you see any of these wildcard teams making a run the way the Phillies did?
I feel like if anything, I feel like it could be Houston if they fall off into the wild card spot, just because they've been there. They've just been there before. So if anything, it'd probably be Houston.
Yeah, and right now out of the wild card matchups, so you mentioned Tampa Bay. It obviously is going to be the wild card. It looks like at this point. You've got Houston. You've got a lot of teams that have won divisions in the past playing in the playoffs. Which wild card matchup would you like to see out of the teams that right now are competing for wild card spots?
I would probably say Tampa and I don't know. I guess Tampa and Seattle. I think it's who is in the top 2 wild card spots right now. I just feel like for the American League, that's just a great matchup. We've seen it with the Tampa Bay Rays and Orioles in the series that they just played. I like Seattle's pitching and their hitting, and Tampa's pitching is probably one of the best pitching staffs in the league right now. So I feel like that could be a good pitching matchup.
Yeah, a lot of really interesting wildcard matchups that we could see this year. The last thing we're going to finish with is what is the best college football game to watch this weekend? Because there's a lot of good ones after 3 weeks of games. So the first one that I have is number 19 Colorado versus number 10 Oregon. This is going to be a great game. You're going to see Colorado playing real competition. Even though Colorado State put up a great fight last week, this is the first time Colorado's playing a ranked team under Deion Sanders. It will be a great matchup. Ohio State versus Notre Dame, 2 teams that are regionally close to each other. You got Sam Hartman, who's competing possibly for the Heisman Trophy. This is going to be Ohio State's biggest test early in the season. They're going to have to prove that they can play with really good competition. The last game that I have is number 7 Penn State versus number 24 Iowa. Look, maybe it's not the best in terms of teams that are that close, but I love Penn State. I love Nicholas Singleton. I think that he needs to prove that he can run against a really good defense. And there's really not many better defenses in the Big Ten than Iowa. And Iowa's got a much improved offense as well. So Penn State really needs to step up this week and prove that they can compete for a college football playoff spot. And that will wrap us up here on Sports Talk Philadelphia. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to check us out on social media at X now, we're going to call it, at Sports Talk LTV, and on our Instagram at Sports Talk LTV. Thank you so much for watching this episode, and make sure to tune in next week.